Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Garhdo Goes Geek. On today's episode, in celebration of the 20th anniversary of the cinematic release of Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring, I'm going to be looking at the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, how it came to be, some fun tidbits in its making, and the adaptations from the book it was originally based on. Hope you'll join me. There's some interesting facts in here, some nice little stories and anecdotes, and it's an exploration of turning a seminal piece of work, which was once decried as unfilmable even by its own author, into a masterpiece of cinema. The story of Lord of the Rings begins, as many people would expect, with an introduction to its author. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, born in 1892, was an English writer, poet, philologist, and academic, with a fascination with mythology and language. Philology itself being the study of language in oral and written historical sources. He was especially fascinated with legends, such as a lot of the Norse and Anglo-Saxon legends and myths. And in his career as an academic, became a professor of both Anglo-Saxon and a professor of English language and literature. At both Pembroke College and Merton College in Oxford, between the years of 1925 and 1959. He was a close friend of C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia series. Both of them formed along with others an informal literary discussion group known as the Inklings. Tolkien was also made a commander of the Order of the British Empire, awarded an OBE, shortly before his death in 1973. He was given the award in 1972. Tolkien's fascination with mythology and language started very early on. When he was a student, he was studying a lot of ancient stories. One in particular he was fascinated was the story of Beowulf, a very classic Norse Anglo-Saxon story. And one of the things that Tolkien wanted to do was to create an English mythology. He felt that England had no mythology itself, due to the end of the Anglo-Saxon period coming with the defeat at the Battle of Hastings with the Norman invasion in 1066. He felt that all Anglo-Saxon mythology had been eradicated from England, and the closest we had to any sort of mythology since then, namely the tales of something like King Arthur, for example. The most famous iteration of King Arthur came from a French novel called La Morte d'Arthur. So, King Arthur, he essentially considered French, not British, not English. And so he wanted to create his own English mythology. But he didn't do it originally himself. What he did as a recent graduate, shortly before he joined the trenches in World War One with a lot of his friends, was he and a group of others worked on the creation of languages, invented languages specifically. And this is where J.R.R. Tolkien created the languages of Elvish. Now, Tolkien had been fascinated with translating languages for years. He'd been translating Old Norse, various Old English and Middle English texts and dialects, and he'd worked on a lot of that for years. It was one of the things he ended up teaching as well. giving courses in like Old English heroic verse. But yeah, Old Norse was one he specifically liked. And he was attracted to a lot of the original English languages as well, such as Gaelic and Welsh. But yeah, it was in his teens where he first started creating his own languages. Um, he first started with a reconstruction of the unrecorded Germanic language, which may have been spoken by the people of Beowulf. Again, like I said, Beowulf was a fascination of his, so he started by creating what that language could have sounded like, what it could have looked like. Um, but then, yes, the Elven tongues, not Elfish, was what he started to create in 1910, 1911. And the first one he created was Quenya. But the more famous one that he created was probably Sindarin. Sindarin is the main Elven language used in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And the creation of a mythology to explain that language is what led to the creation of The Lord of the Rings. The reason for this being that Tolkien was of the opinion that the invention of an artistic language to be convincing and pleasing must include not only the language's historical development, but also the history of its speakers, and especially the mythology associated with both the language and the speakers. So it was because of this that he decided that the Elvish language would had to be associated with the complex history and mythology of the elves, and that formed the basis of the work that would later be known as Tolkien's Legendarium. Most of the Legendarium refers to the works that Tolkien worked on throughout the decades that remained unpublished in his lifetime, but were summarized in the compilation The Silmarillion, which was released by his son after his death, as well as in the 12-volume series The History of Middle-earth. The first known origination of anything in the Legendarium was in 1914, where even while serving in the First World War, Tolkien began writing poems and story sketches, drawing maps, and inventing languages and names as part of his project to create this English mythology. The earliest story drafts were from 1916, shortly before Tolkien fought in the Battle of the Somme. And Tolkien continued revising and rewriting these for most of his adult life. Now, it's quite likely that most of this, as I said, most of it was unpublished, and most of it would have remained unpublished probably had Tolkien not found success with another work. Now, according to Tolkien's own recollections, he began work on what would become The Hobbit one day in the 1930s while marking school certificate papers. He found a blank page and, suddenly inspired, wrote the words, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." He then completed the work The Hobbit, which he designed as a children's story. He read it to his own children, but completed the manuscript by the end of 1932 and lent it to several friends, including C.S. Lewis and a student of his named Elaine Griffiths. In 1936, Griffiths was visited in Oxford by Susan Dagnall, a staff member of the publisher George Allen and Unwin, and she is reported to have either lent Dagnall the book or suggested that Dagnall borrow it from Tolkien. But in any event, Dagnall was impressed by it and showed it to Stanley Unwin, who then asked his 10-year-old son Rayner to review it. And it was Rayner's favourable comments that led Allen and Unwin to publish The Hobbit in 1937. Now, The Hobbit, I probably don't need to explain too much, was the story of a hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, who is visited by a company of dwarves and a wizard named Gandalf, and embroiled by them to be their burglar on a quest to reclaim their lost mountain home from a vicious dragon named Smaug. The story is very, very good. Each chapter is almost like a mini story in itself, but they're all connected by part of this larger adventure. And yeah, if it's a charming story. It's very much a kid's story and a very fantasy fairy tale almost story. But it proceeded to receive very, very wide critical acclaim. It was nominated for a Carnegie Medal. It was awarded a prize from the New York Herald Tribune for Best Juvenile Fiction. And it remains popular and a classic of literature to this very day. And as a result of that, Alan and Unwin, especially Stanley Unwin, began asking for a sequel to The Hobbit. And that was what prompted J.R.R. Tolkien to begin writing what would become The Lord of the Rings. It was while writing the sequel to The Hobbit that J.R.R. Tolkien went back to the mythology that he had written years before to create The Lord of the Rings. Now, he saw The Lord of the Rings itself as being just a small part of the myth that he'd created. And it eventually turned into something much bigger than just a sequel for The Hobbit. It took 12 years to write, with several rewrites, and every time J.R.R. Tolkien did a rewrite, he literally rewrote the entire novel from the start each time. He also described it himself more as a sequel to the Silmarillion, the works that he'd been working on in private, due to the greater focus on the mythology and the more adult tone of the novel. He described it as an adult fairy tale, as well, because Tolkien had been very outspoken in that fairy tales should be something that adults could enjoy as well. And yeah, it's an interesting novel. It was also while writing Lord of the Rings that he went back to The Hobbit as well and reworked parts of that to make it more in line with the sequel that he was currently writing, including a very large rewrite of a chapter in The Hobbit called The Riddles in the Dark. Riddles in the Dark is the chapter in The Hobbit where Bilbo obtains the magic ring from the creature Gollum. Now, they play a game of riddles, and in the original version of The Hobbit, Gollum lets Bilbo go once Bilbo wins the game of riddles. And I think as well, the magic ring is part of a gift, in a way, to Bilbo. However, in the new version of Riddles in the Dark, the ring becomes the main object of the game, something that Bilbo has obtained himself beforehand, and Gollum turns on Bilbo, and it is only Bilbo pitying Gollum that allows Gollum to escape unscathed. So yeah, the Riddles in the Dark chapter was completely overhauled as part of the rewrite. Now, The Lord of the Rings is a very unusual book. It was written as 6 books with 6 appendices, as one story. What I mean in this definition of book is, each book is a collection of several chapters of the novel, about a dozen a piece, so 10 to 14, I think, is the average number of chapters, detailing part of the story. usually with some sort of climatic event towards the end of that particular book. And for a lot of the books throughout the story, there is a perspective shift as well as you move into the next one. Now, the original intention of Tolkien was that The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion would be 2 volumes of the same work that would be released. Unfortunately, that never happened. Lord of the Rings was the publisher passed on the Silmarillion at the time, and they went with the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings then, for economic reasons, mainly post-war paper shortages, meant that it was cheaper to publish it as smaller novels. And that's where you get the divisions into the trilogy, which were Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. And those were then published over the course of a year between 1954 and 1955. With each of those 2 books per volume. So the first 2 books form Fellowship of the Ring, the second 2 form The Two Towers, the last 2 and the appendices form Return of the King. There were obviously releases over the years since that have put the entire work into 1 volume as part of Tolkien's original intent. Now, the book initially had a very mixed reception by the literary establishment. It's a very divisive work in some respects. It's very, very atypical. The main villain is never really shown. Sauron is a present threat throughout the novel, but we never have him encounter any of the heroes. The main villain of the piece is the ring. The opening of the novel, book 1, is very, very long. It takes like a good 12 chapters, 12, 14 chapters before we get to any sort of huge story purposes towards the later part of the work. Characters are often left unexplored for large chapters, if not whole books. For example, once Two Towers starts, books 3 and 5 will focus on most of the Fellowship characters. So, for example, Merry, Pippin, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Whereas books 4 and 6 focus on Frodo and Sam and their continuing journey towards Mount Doom to destroy the ring. I should say I'm just talking about plot elements for Lord of the Rings, as I assume at this point most people are familiar with either the films or the novel of the Lord of the Rings, either first-hand or by cultural osmosis. Everyone knows what the Lord of the Rings is. Now, what this means is this division of characters per book is that you spend large portions of either work. So, for example, if you're reading The Two Towers, you spend the entire first half of the book not knowing anything about what has happened to Frodo and Sam since we last saw them at the end of Fellowship. And then once you start reading book 4 of The Two Towers, you no longer know, you get to a point where you don't know anything of what's happening to Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, Pippin, Theoden, Saruman, anything beyond what is happening to Frodo and Sam until you start reading Return of the King. Which is a very, very interesting way to take the story. Not only that, several important events don't really occur within the story. They're related to us via flashback. So, for example, in book 1, Gandalf leaves Frodo and says he'll meet him in Bree. Frodo and the others arrive in Bree several chapters later, and Gandalf hasn't been seen. we then don't see Gandalf until shortly before the Council of Elrond. And it's there that we learn what actually happened to Gandalf and why he was waylaid for so long. Or, for example, the March of the Ents is told through flashback when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli arrive in Isengard, and we see that Merry, Pippin, and Treebeard have conquered it. So yeah, it's a bizarre book, a very good book. But you know, it became extraordinarily popular over the years. It went on to become the second most read of the book of the 20th century, behind only the Bible. Which gives you an idea of just how ever present the Lord of the Rings is. It's the archetypical fantasy book. Most fantasy settings are based on or inspired by the Lord of the Rings, in terms of the stereotypical fantasy races, for example, like dwarves, elves, and men, are in everything because they were in Lord of the Rings. So Dungeons and Dragons, most video games you can think of that take a fantasy setting, Warhammer, etc., all follow a blueprint laid down by the Lord of the Rings. And that's not counting as well the artworks, music, films, televisions, video games, board games, radio adaptations, everything that was inspired directly by the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, it was a very it's a good book, and it has a lasting impact on people. It's become studied intensely. Many people have done extensive analysis of the themes and origins of the Lord of the Rings. There are people who specialize in being a scholar of Tolkien's works, the Lord of the Rings chief among them. Now, as I said, it was originally published as a trilogy. The titles for the trilogy, Fellowship and The Two Towers, were both titled by Tolkien himself. Return of the King was the title suggested by the publisher. And it was a title that Tolkien was not a fan of. He preferred the title The War of the Ring. He felt that Return of the King gave away the conclusion of the story. But I suppose there is kind of an abstract nature, as you don't know which king. The speculation is Aragorn, but it could also speculate Sauron. Two Towers is never actually explained as to which Two Towers the novel seems to be referring to. The common thought, especially off the back of the film, is Isengard and Barad-dûr, which is the Tower of Sauron. Isengard, the Tower of Orthanc, Isengard being the Tower of Saruman. But it could just as likely be the Towers of Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul, the Tower of Barad-dûr and the Tower of Cirith Ungol. There's many Two Towers that could be. There's a lot of towers in Middle Earth that it could be mentioning. The book is quite famous for featuring something called eucatastrophe. Eucatastrophe is a term coined by Tolkien himself, using the prefix "eu" before the word catastrophe to indicate the opposite of a catastrophe, whereas at the greatest moment of despair, a positive outcome will occur. This is something he'd also done to some extent in The Hobbit. There's plenty of points in The Hobbit where things seem their most bleak for our heroes, and then something will happen out of nowhere that changes the fortunes. For example, Bard the Bowman being able to kill Smaug during his attack on Lake Town, or the arrival of the Eagles during the Battle of the Five Armies. And, you know, Lord of the Rings is full of similar moments. And they are tremendously positive moments for the reader. You know, moments where armies arrive to help beleaguered cities, or characters come to each other's rescue. They're beautiful moments to read and lovely to see. Lord of the Rings is also often cited as being an allegorical work. People have compared it to the rise of Nazism, to Tolkien's experiences in World War One, East and West divides, all sorts of things like that. Tolkien accepted that there may be influences on his work, but he himself specifically decried it as being an allegorical work. In the introduction, he was a professor of literature and language, so I'm inclined to agree with him on this, because the man knew what he was talking about. If he says there's no allegory there, there is no direct allegory there. I think all works have an element of some politics within them, unintentional or intentional. But I think if anyone would know how to make a work as intentionally non-allegorical as possible, it is someone with the experience and knowledge of J.R.R. Tolkien. He personally had a disdain for allegory, but he does say that an applicability remains within the work, allowing readers to draw allegory over the decades. But there are themes in the work that are deliberate, but aren't necessarily allegorical. The main themes of the work are the seductive evil, so the power of the ring and how it can corrupt normal people to evil. The idea of plurality versus the one. The armies of Sauron are one force, one goal in mind, whereas it's the many races that stand against them, the free peoples of Middle-earth, that are able to defeat them. So the armies of Rohan, Gondor, the elves, the dwarves, the hobbits, the clash of nature versus industry, for example, with the Ent March on Isengard. And one of my favourite themes in the work is the power of the underestimated. A lot of people, for example, like to cite that, especially people who have only seen the films, that, they could have just taken the Eagles and dropped the ring in Mount Doom, ignoring the fact that, one, the Eagles are sentient in and of themselves and might not agree to do so, but it's specifically because Frodo was the one carrying the ring that he's able to succeed. The Eagles are a big statement piece. You know, Sauron would see them coming for miles and know of their arrival and prepare for it. Hobbits are underestimated. At several points in the work, they're even underestimated by their friends, by their, by their comrades in the Fellowship. Even Gandalf himself underestimates them at certain points. But the four hobbits themselves, not just Frodo and Sam, but Merry and Pippin as well, are responsible for several amazing points in the story. It's their manipulations that wake the Ents up, that allow Gandalf to meet up with Aragorn, that save Faramir's life, and importantly, destroy the ring. You know, four diminutive hobbits, And this goes back to the novel The Hobbit itself. It's Bilbo being this unassuming burglar being used by the dwarves. The dwarves quite often disregard Bilbo for his shorter stature than them, and also his his very different attitude to theirs. And yet Bilbo is the one able to get into the mountain. He's the one able to talk to Smaug. He's the one able to get the Arkenstone and everything that they're after. So yeah, people are also talking about the War of the Ring, and the allegories comparing to Tolkien's experiences in World War One. Tolkien hated war. In his experiences in World War One and on the Battle of the Somme would probably be a large part of that. A lot of his friends that he served with died. People who were in clubs with him as a graduate and as a young student died. A lot of his close friends who he shared his writings with died. So Tolkien definitely had a hatred of war, but I think he saw that the War of the Ring was something that needed to be fought, in a similar way to maybe not World War One, which was a bit more of a futile war if you look back on it in history, in historical context, but World War Two especially, which he was writing Lord of the Rings during the backdrop of. I think everyone can agree that World War Two was something that needed to be fought. Nazis needed to be opposed, and the evil that the Nazis presented is similar to the evil that Sauron presents as something that needs to be opposed. Yeah. The appendixes in The Lord of the Rings, I've not really explained them. They are sort of extra material that Tolkien wanted to include, but for whatever reason couldn't fit into the actual story without setting its balance. Tolkien does describe several of them as quite important. There's the history of the Fellowship through the early Fourth Age, sort of explaining what happens to the characters of Legolas, Gimli, Aragorn, Merry, Pippin, etc., which is quite a nice one to actually see. There's the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, a love story that is between one of the main characters and his elven princess, which is one that, again, Tolkien described as particularly important to one of his favorite pieces of the appendices, but he was not able to include without disrupting the flow of the novel. Return of the King especially is also, I wouldn't say rushed, but the book definitely speeds up as it approaches the climax. There are things that would have been elaborated into several pages if they were in Fellowship or the Two Towers. Maybe only get a paragraph or two in Return of the King. Return of the King is a very, very dense part of the trilogy. There's a lot that happens in it. And I think that's one of the reasons as well why people might have decried it as unfilmable for years. Like I said, even Tolkien sold the film rights for The Lord of the Rings quite early on, very, very cheaply, thinking that it wouldn't be able to be filmed. For myself, I do like the Lord of the Rings novel. I'm not necessarily the hugest fan of Tolkien's writing. I do think his prose can be very, very involved with descriptions, and it can be somewhat dense in points, but it is incredibly imaginative, very, very descriptive. And you do feel enveloped by the world of Middle Earth as you read it. I do think it's slow to start. Book one is a bit of a chore to get through. It's only once you arrive in Rivendell at the start of book two that the story really starts to progress. Um, there are some odd characters and arcs which can become at odds with things presented. For example, we spend a lot of Fellowship of the Ring building the ring up as this huge, powerful, corrupting influence. We see how it corrupts Boromir, what it did to Gollum, and then in book four, Frodo encounters Faramir, who is Boromir's brother, and Faramir is able to refuse the ring straight away. Or, for example, Aragorn, who is in his 80s and is well known as the heir of Elendil and Isildur, and wants to return to to become king of Gondor. But as I said, this is a man in his 80s who hasn't done it yet. And you're not sure why he hasn't done it yet. It's you know, if this is something he's determined to do, why has he not made more effort to do it? Why has he not returned to the throne of Gondor or tried to rebuild Arnor in the north? Uh, I it's a good novel. I do enjoy it, but I must admit I haven't reread it in a while, and some bits I probably remember less fondly than others. Um, I think myself, it's probably been at least a good 15 years since I've read it, and I probably owe it another read at some point. Yeah. Um, Lord of the Rings, I should point out, was also very, very popular after its release with hippies and counterculture protesters due to the themes of fighting war and corruption and the environmental protection, the nature versus industry that I mentioned earlier. So I became more familiar as a child with the concepts within the Lord of the Rings, certain characters and themes, due to predominantly the music of Led Zeppelin. Um, my father used to listen to Led Zeppelin an awful lot, and I grew up listening to them. And there's many, many, many references in a lot of Led Zeppelin's music to the works of Tolkien. Um, and Led Zeppelin are far from the only band that included such references. Um, I also listened to, when I was a kid, um, a lot of the 1981 BBC Radio 4 adaptation that was done, which is incredible. A very, very good take on the Lord of the Rings. It makes a lot of changes to the novel. Well, some changes to the novel, some omissions and deviations from the novel that would also be echoed in the works of Peter Jackson later on when he adapted Lord of the Rings. For example, the removal of the character of Tom Bombadil and tightening up of certain story elements in the early part of the book, as well as including the revised Riddles in the Dark chapter, um, and several other, presenting events in flashbacks that we are actually able to witness and experience, and melding the storylines, so not following the book three, book four approach. And that as well. If you can ever track it down, I highly recommend it. It's a very, very good story. It's got a lot of quite prime British acting talent. The part of Frodo himself is played by Ian Holm, who went on to play Bilbo in the film adaptation. Sam is played by Bill Nighy, an actor probably most famous for his roles in Shaun of the Dead and Pirates of the Caribbean to a lot of people. But he was also in Love Actually and several other films. Very, very good actor. He plays Sam in it. He's brilliant at it. Um, John LeMessurier of Dad's Army played the role of Bilbo Baggins, and Aragorn, the character of Strider, is played by Sir Robert Stevens, um, who is a tremendous theatre actor, one time regarded as one of the natural successors to Laurence Olivier. Um, and yeah, he does a brilliant job as Aragorn in the work. It's it's 26 episodes, 26 half-hour episodes, and I'd highly recommend that to anyone. But we're not here today to talk about the radio, or the novel, but we are here to talk about the film adaptation. Now, Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings was not the first attempt to film the work. Previous attempts to film it had been made by many people and usually resulted in a couple of unproduced scripts, concept art, or an animated short, but not really much else. People including Peter Shaffer, Walt Disney, Forrest Ackerman, George Lucas had all been involved in attempting to develop Lord of the Rings as a film at some point. The rights passed through the hands of many, many different studios before they were eventually sold perpetually to United Artists. In 1976, United Artists passed the rights to The Lord of the Rings and part of the rights to The Hobbit to Fantasy Films. That led to an animated adaptation in 1977 of The Hobbit, produced by Rankin and Bass. And in 1978, Ralph Bakshi made an animated feature of the first half of Lord of the Rings. Now, while profitable, the film didn't make enough money to automatically warrant the sequel, which would close the story. One of the things that I was fearing might happen, for example, with Dune by Denis Villeneuve. So, these things do happen where part of the story is made, but the second one, even if successful, doesn't automatically get off the ground. There was arguments between Bakshi and one of the producers as well that led him to abandon the project, and Rankin and Bass then followed in 1980 with an animated TV adaptation of The Return of the King. Several other Tolkien-esque fantasy films were developed at the time, including Jim Henson and Frank Oz's Dark Crystal and George Lucas's Willow. But getting a proper live action Lord of the Rings seemed unlikely. Now, Peter Jackson, as a teenager, hadn't read the book, but upon watching Bakshi's films, he said he enjoyed it, but the fact that the story hadn't been finished, it made him want to read the book to find out what happened. He later read The Hobbit and The Silmarillion, listened to the BBC One radio adaptation. Not BBC One, sorry, just BBC radio adaptation. And he always assumed someone would eventually adapt it into a live action film, but no one did. Now, in 1995, while he was completing post production on The Frighteners, Jackson and his partner Fran Walsh discussed making an original fantasy film, but couldn't think of any scenarios that weren't Tolkien-esque. This is what I mean when I say that Lord of the Rings had this huge impact on the fantasy genre, and that most things are Tolkien-esque, in similar sort of ways to his works. So it was at that point that they decided to look up the film rights, and they went to Harvey Weinstein at Miramax, who had recently acquired the rights from Saul Zaentz, who was the producer on the Ralph Bakshi film. Jackson knew that it would take multiple films to do Lord of the Rings justice, and pitched a single trilogy, one film based on The Hobbit, and then if that would prove successful, 2 Lord of the Rings films shot back to back. However, it turned out that the Hobbit rights were unattainable because they had been split between Saul Zaentz and United Artists. Weinstein tried to buy United Artists' share of the rights, but was unsuccessful. So, with The Hobbit postponed for a later prequel, Jackson proceeded with making 2 Lord of the Rings films, pitched the idea of 3 films, and Miramax didn't want to take that risk, so they agreed on 2. While writing the script and working on storyboards and discussing casting ideas, etc., he used his own acquisitions, Weta Workshop and Weta Digital, to begin working on props, concept art, software development, etc. However, as the scripts began to take shape, Miramax started to panic. The budget required for these films would have exceeded their capabilities, and the Weinstein suggested cutting the project to 1 film. Jackson inquired whether the film would be around 4 hours in duration, but Miramax insisted on doing it in 2 hours, suggesting major cuts to the Lord of the Rings story, which Jackson refused to do. Harvey Weinstein threatened to replace Jackson with another screenwriter and another director, including potentially John Madden or Quentin Tarantino, which Jackson believes was an empty threat to get him to concede. But what happened was that Jackson shopped around and eventually got an audience with a CEO of New Line, Robert Shea, who Jackson pitched him the 2-film project, and Shea said, well, surely this should be a trilogy. So yeah, it was that decision that meant that Jackson took his final work, all the pre-production he'd been doing under Miramax, and went and took the film to New Line Entertainment. Now, there were several changes had to be made to The Lord of the Rings, obviously, even to accommodate the trilogy. Several scenes and subplots had to be cut. One of the biggest removals in the early part of the story is the removal of Tom Bombadil. As I said, Tom Bombadil was a bit of a distraction of a character, even in the original novel. And the BBC radio adaptation also omitted him. I'm sorry, my phone keeps going. I do apologise. One of the other major cuts was the Scouring of the Shire towards the end of the story. The Scouring of the Shire, for those who aren't familiar with it, involves the hobbits returning back to the Shire to find that Saruman has taken over, and they use their experience gained during the War of the Ring and the leadership qualities that they've gained to lead the Shire into rebellion and defeat Saruman. It's an interesting plot thread in the book because it finalizes the conclusion of their character growth, and also in the original book, Saruman is presented as sort of independent from Sauron in a lot of respects, as just another threat. but for the films, they changed that and made Saruman more subservient, I suppose, to Sauron. Other characters, other things from the novel were moved around. Lines were given to other characters. Lines that maybe were in descriptions were turned into dialogue. Um, Things like Shelob and the Stairs of Cirith were moved to Return of the King so that it didn't intercut with the Helm's Deep battle in the Two Towers. However, that also fits the timeline of the novel, due to the ways that books 3, 4, 5, and 6 were written. Um, book 4 overlaps with the entirety of book 3 and the first half of book 5. But this only becomes apparent to the reader when Tolkien, in several chapters, will indicate that something is happening at the same time as something in a previous book. So, for example, one of Frodo's encounters with Faramir, I believe, is stated to be around the same time as the Battle of Helm's Deep. And one of, the ride of the Rohirrim is stated to be at the same time as Frodo and Sam were ascending the stairs to Cirith Ungol. But this only becomes apparent when you read the novel. So if you actually look at the timeline, things that are in the Two Towers novel actually fit better with the timeline of Return of the King. There was a very strong desire on the part of the filmmakers to attempt to always stay true to what Tolkien wrote, even when adding scenes or as actors grew to empathize with their characters. The actors were given input into, they were allowed to make inputs in line delivery or to add things, but always with the intention to keep it within the spirit of the characters and within the spirit of the original writing. So to fit with the original story or to use similar wording in some respects as well, due to the very particular way of Tolkien's prose. However, some drastic changes did have to be made to accommodate the transformation into film. For example, the Council of Elrond, which is a large scene, is definitely one long chapter. It may even take place over a couple of chapters in the novel, which is used mainly as a way of setting the stage. This is where we find out about Saruman. This is where we find out about the armies in the north, Angmar, all these Dol Guldur and all these things like that are threats to the wider world of Middle Earth, as well as the question of what to do with the ring is just streamlined to keep the focus on the ring and Frodo's acceptance of the responsibility of destroying it. Or Faramir, for example, who his character arc changes in that he's tempted by the ring and succumbs to it, due to the built up evilness and seductive nature of the ring across the first movie, and as a result becomes an obstacle for Frodo to overcome. Personally, that's a change I'm totally in favor with. As I said, I don't think Faramir just having tea and letting Frodo go. I think it undercuts how the ring has been built up, in the work, as the ring is this malevolent threat, and for Faramir to, to be quite calm with it is bizarre. I do think as well that change to Faramir helps to give Faramir a more complete arc throughout the story as well, especially in the Two Towers. There was also a focus by Jackson and the other filmmakers to include Aragorn and Arwen, and their relationship due to Tolkien's description of their story as the most important appendix. For those who aren't aware, Aragorn and Arwen is based on the story of Beren and Luthien, which is a story that appears in the Silmarillion and was also turned into its own novel. Um, Beren and Luthien is an elf woman who gives up her immortality to love a man named Beren. Um, Tolkien and his wife both have on their gravestones the names Beren and Luthien, respectively. Um, it was very, very clear that this was a love story that Tolkien was very, very invested in and saw, um, in the love that he and his wife shared. So, having Aragorn and Arwen be an important echo of that, it's no wonder he saw it as important. There are also some other changes which are not in the novel or even implied. For example, the addition of the elves to the Battle of Helm's Deep to give that action scene a more hopeful note against the large opposing force, which is an element of the catastrophe that you would have got in within the novel. There is something stirring to a viewer to see the elves arrive at Helm's Deep, even though even the most ardent Tolkien fans would find fault with it. But the elves were fighting in the War of the Ring as well. War did come to Lothlorien and to Rivendell and to Mirkwood as well. So the fact that the elves are at the battle is something that should happen. Um, a lot of these changes, though, as the films were released, the changes in Two Towers especially were considered controversial compared to the changes in Fellowship, despite screenwriter Philippa Boyens saying that there were probably more changes in Fellowship. But they all serve the story and they serve the adaptation. For example, giving Two Towers a narrative climax. Um, which it doesn't have in the novel because it was never intended to be a standalone novel, or it was intended to be part of a larger work, the middle chapter of a large body of work. Um, there were copies of the novel everywhere in production. Peter Jackson had copies. Most of the actors had copies. Um, People at all levels of the production were had copies everywhere. Um, there were almost daily rewrites as the writers, director, and actors all got input into crafting scenes. New scenes were generally only added, though, if they needed to be seen for the story. Um, for example, offering a different perspective or or a necessary part of the adaptation. Again, something like Frodo and Sam's lines about stories at the climax of the Two Towers to give that film a narrative climax. Or for example, to illustrate things that were flashbacks in the novel, such as Gandalf's escape from Orthanc. Um, is a necessary addition to the film. Um, a lot of scenes also tried to have multiple purposes. So, for example, Merry and Pippin's intro in Fellowship of the Ring is a very good example of this, of being multi-purpose. It introduces the two characters. It creates a light moment at the party before some of the more unsettling natures about the origins of the ring is revealed. And it uses the Smaug firework from the novel um, to create a big set piece. Um, so it's a scene that accomplishes three different tasks. Um, the intention was always to focus on the story of Frodo and the ring, but obviously to embellish the characters around that. So, for example, Arwen is one example of a character who's barely present in the book, who was given more development in the film, but it's usually using book material. So, for example, it's Arwen who comes to save Frodo instead of Glorfindel, um, and take him to Rivendell. Glorfindel does this in the novel, and is pretty much never seen again. I think he briefly appears at the Council of Elrond and then is never seen again. Whereas Arwen doing it allows her to interact with Aragorn and to introduce her, and you know, take something that's a role and taken by a side character and give it to a main character for the story. Arwen was originally planned to be at Helm's Deep as well, but with the other elves, but that was changed during production. Um, it was originally done that so that they could have scenes with her interacting with Aragorn, to continue that love story. Um, but they decided against it. Like I said, even earlier into adaptation, um, to follow the appendix more closely by using flashbacks in Rivendell to tell that story instead. They also There was also an effort to make sure to include even descriptive moments in the film. For example, where Frodo wakes up in Rivendell. Before shooting the scene, Ian McKellen reminded Sean Austin to grab Frodo's hand because he says in the novel, Sam holds Frodo's hand in this scene, so people will be looking for that. I mean, it's inevitable that things would get changed as part of the adaptation, but I think there is very much a concerted effort on the part of the filmmakers to stay true to the themes of the Lord of the Rings, especially, and to stay true to the story. Um, some chapters are moved around to match the storyline chronology and to structure the story better. For example, the confrontation with Saruman in the extended cut of Return of the King was originally meant to be the conclusion for Two Towers, but it wasn't working as the conclusion for Two Towers, so they didn't use it and instead decided to use it as the introduction of Return of the King. But even then, they were still struggling with it as part of the introduction there. So omitted it from the theatrical cut, and instead put it back in for the extended DVD. Other scenes like the mouth of Sauron in Return of the King has less of an impact than it does in the novel, due to the change of the chronology. Because by the time that happens in Book 5 in Return of the King, we actually, as the reader, don't know that Frodo is alive. When we saw Frodo, he was being carried off by the orcs to Cirith Ungol, after being stabbed by Shelob. So, as a reader, we don't know if he's dead. We don't know how Sauron got the mouth of Sauron got the mithril shirt. So, while it's a good scene to film, and you still have the resolution of the characters like Aragorn, Gandalf, Merry, and Pippin deciding not to believe the mouth, that Sauron is dead. That Frodo is dead. Because we as an audience know that Frodo is still alive, it has a bit of less of an impact. So I can see why something like that was taken out, and only used for the extended cut, because it doesn't make as much sense in the theatrical cut of the story. Now, the entire trilogy of The Lord of the Rings was storyboarded by Jackson and his team. Those storyboards were then turned into a pretty basic animatic, by literally filming the storyboards. And that animatic was then enhanced with some basic voices and music, some like, holdover temporary music, and a few local actors in New Zealand who were brought in to voice the entire film. That animatic was then screened for all of the actors before filming, allowing them to visualize the film, which it also worked for the filmmakers for that same purpose. So, editors could be shown the basic look of how the film would look, and then that could then expand. They could develop from that original animatic. Some basic models were built to plan shots around, which could then be used as a guide for set dressers or miniature makers later on, so that Peter Jackson could get the exact same angle on the real finished model or the finished set that he'd been able to attain on the miniature model. Um, Back End, for example, was the first set built in order to work out the scene. Um, they acted the scene, they worked out where the cameras were, and it was just a rough bag end, that wasn't decorated. It was literally just a wooden frame in the shape of bag end. There was also pre-visualization done for the action sequences and effect shots, which is a way of previs essentially the transformation into early CGI elements, animated CGI elements, or sometimes with models and other things. That was all done with help and input from Rick McCallum and George Lucas, who at the time were working on the Star Wars prequel trilogy. And it was based on their own work with those films. This all allowed Jackson to get a 3D view of scenes and plan out how to shoot them. Even scenes that would end up being CGI creations or on miniatures or other things. Jackson had a plan to do the film, and he apparently said this to all the filmmakers, to view it as though Lord of the Rings was an actual history, and they were going to be able to shoot in the locations where that history took place. The idea of building clothes, not costumes, of building a building and not building sets. And that was the sort of the methodology, the through line that went through the production. Tolkien very early on recruited two illustrators who have been famously working on Tolkien art for years. Chances are, if you own an illustrated version of any of Tolkien's works, or whether it be a novel or a calendar or anything like that, chances are it involves one of these two people. They are Alan Lee and John Howe, both of whom very readily agreed to be part of the project. And both of whom were brought in early into the production, but at least a year of pre-production was already underway. Weta Workshop and Weta Digital were responsible for building sets, miniatures, CGI assets, all of it being done within the same studio, which meant everything could be designed with a very unified tone. So, for example, sets, miniatures, and costumes, for, say, the elves, would all have a similar design aesthetic. There was a real attempt to incorporate the history and culture of Middle-earth into the film at every level, done by using, for example, the ruins of Weathertop feature references to the ancient Numenorians. In some respects, certain scenes could be created based on concept art or miniature design. So, for example, I believe it was John Howe created the Bridge of Khazad-dûm and drew a sketch of the stairs of Khazad-dûm, and he drew this winding, long, diagonal staircase, which then prompted Peter Jackson to craft an action sequence around that. Firstly, by designing it with the miniature of how the Fellowship would get down these stairs while under attack by orcs and being chased by the Balrog. And then they eventually filmed that sequence. The script, apparently, according to Jackson and Philippa Boyens, still says to this day the Fellowship run down the stairs. But it's a 5-minute action sequence in the film of the Fellowship going down the stairs. A lot of the real sets had to be constructed. So, for example, Hobbiton, the location of Hobbiton, was actually constructed in farmland outside of Wellington, New Zealand, and the construction began about a year before filming, so that it would all look natural as everything grew. And it involved, for example, the openings of all the hobbit holes, a fake oak tree which sits on top of Bag End, which had to be fully created, as well as all the gardens, the farmland, everything like that around Hobbiton. Edoras was also constructed. Edoras is the capital of Rohan, and it was filmed in an area of conservation, so it had to be restored after filming perfectly, exactly as it was left. So all grass and vegetation that was removed had to be kept in a nursery for 18 months, so that it could all be replanted after filming. So as part of the construction of Edoras, they also had to construct this plant nursery for grasses and vegetation that had been lifted from the top of this small mountain peak. The Golden Hall of Edoras as well also had to be thatched. It was described as having a thatched roof, which isn't something that is really a thing in New Zealand. So the workshop team had to learn how to do thatching so that they could make a thatched roof. They used a device to create small hay bales that would allow them to do it. So yeah, Edoras was built in around 8 months and then shot on for 8 days. All of the external shots on Edoras are done within the same 8-day window. Helm's Deep was built in separate parts, as well as built as a miniature. There was a miniature scale version of Helm's Deep. They were all built in the same quarry, so they're all all the different versions of the set are several yards from each other. Lots of scenery from other sets, once they'd been filmed on and destroyed, were saved to be used for the ruins of Osgiliath, the city that is under assault from orcs outside of Minas Tirith across the river. The quarry that was used for Helm's Deep was then used for Minas Tirith after the conclusion of the Helm's Deep filming. Minas Tirith was built to scale, so the actual set was huge and included the large working gates that are seen in the film, as well as side streets leading off from a large square, several buildings and all these other things. So a lot of those scenes in Minas Tirith are shot on the one redressed set. Quite large set in this quarry. Minas Tirith Citadel was a large set that was placed in a huge warehouse. Yet, even though the warehouse was enormous, the set itself was so big that to light it, they had to get permission from the harbour board to cut holes in the concrete walls of this enormous warehouse to light the set inside. It's Just incredible the scale of things that they did and how much they were able to do real. How many of these sets are real and not locations? Because the thing is, there aren't locations that you could use for something like this, which is something you don't think of until you read it or you hear them talking about it on the documentaries, on the appendices that are on the DVDs. Um, Pickups and reshoots for all of the films were done in Stone Street, which I believe is the studio in Wellington where they were shooting. They essentially describe it as things being done in the car park, but essentially it was a large open space where they were able to have multiple different sets at the same time. Throughout, and they were able to shoot scenes from throughout the trilogy all together. Sometimes several years after the original scenes filmed for the sets, so actors would be moved from one set to another to complete scenes and reshoots. With Jackson often biking in between sets, he had a bicycle for his personal use to ride around the different Stone Street sets. The battle at the Black Gate at the conclusion of Return of the King was filmed in a location where the New Zealand Army actually does live fire exercises. So several soldiers and sergeants actually acted as extras and were apparently fighting for real, which broke quite a lot of the props. They originally filmed scenes of Sauron against Aragorn there. They were going to reintroduce Sauron for this final battle before changing their mind and deciding to focus on the story of Frodo. Sauron was even going to appear in his fair version from the Silmarillion before transforming into his more monstrous form. And the characters react to that at some point as well. But it was decided that the focus should be on Frodo and the Ring, so instead they gave Aragorn a cave troll to fight, and the reactions to the fair Sauron were used for Aragorn's reaction to the eye of Sauron and it glaring at him, with a final pickup shot added of Aragorn saying "for Frodo" before charging into battle. The entire trilogy was shot in a 438-day shoot over 14 months after 3.5 years of pre-production. This was a massive undertaking by all involved to complete these films and to put the best adaptation of this work out there. The film had to have its own prop department to create everything. That was the Weta Workshop. Things couldn't be sourced, and oftentimes anything that they needed to make also needed scale duplicates. So a lot of things had to be made 3 times. So, for example, there'd be the normal size thing that the hobbits would be using, a smaller size which would be used for any of the larger actors in the scene. And then sometimes some objects would be made, things that were in a human scale would then be given a larger size to be used by the Hobbit actors. You get plenty of craftsmen involved. There was apparently Weta Workshop used a glass blower, carpenters, saddle makers, coopers, wheelwrights, blacksmiths. Everything was involved in this production, and in fact, the Weta Workshop documentaries on the Lord of the Rings extended edition DVDs are some of the most fascinating. They described there was about 3,000 people in the crew at Weta Workshop, 300 of which were in the art department. So their job was to make, to come up with the ideas for all these items that were being created. 45,000 different items were made by Weta Workshop, including prosthetics, armor, weapons, miniatures. The four Hobbit leads alone used 18,000 prosthetic feet. I'm not sure if that includes their scale doubles as well, or if that number then has to be doubled for scale and stunt doubles, or if it's just for the four characters. Because each set of feet had to be removed at the end of a day's shooting and shredded, because removing them from the actor's feet would actually destroy the prosthetic. They described they had ovens going 24/7 for a period of several years, just creating different latex pieces, different prosthetic pieces to be used for all of the actors. Um, Weta Workshop decided quite early on that they wanted to work for many different departments to create a cohesive vision of the films, so that there was one studio responsible for producing every weapon, every set, every piece of clothing, every digital artifact that would need to be used for every army, um, which I think is amazing, and I think it really does show the dedication they had to making this film the best it could possibly be. Um, they tend to also use a lot of large miniatures rather than matte paintings. Matte paintings, for anyone who's not aware, are a traditional thing in filmmaking circles. The Star Wars trilogy, for example, is quite famous for its use of matte paintings, and they are a flat painted surface that you can insert actors or parts of a set into a small corner, to provide a vista or a background that looks fantastical and otherworldly. Weta Workshop, instead of using matte paintings, tend to use digital productions, and miniatures. And when I say miniatures, I mean more bigatures, but I'll discuss that later on. All the creatures were tend to be designs in a way that they sort of made sense. So, for example, the trolls, the cave trolls, were designed to have like a very hard back and a soft belly, as if they'd kind of curled up and look like a rock. And they were given large shovel-like nails to dig with. Um, the armor smiths working on creating all the armor for the film worked it out of real metal, um, plate steel usually. Um, they also found a way to make a very realistic and light chainmail that the actors would be able to use using plastic pipe. Over 12 kilometers of hose pipe was used to make 12.5 million rings, which would then be woven into chainmail suits over a period of 3.5 years. The two workmen doing it basically did that for 3.5 years, just make chainmail suits, and apparently they wore away their fingerprints on their index and thumb. Um, eight Gimli's armor alone apparently contains 80,000 pieces of the chainmail rings, um, which is a crazy amount. And then you look at someone like Denethor, who wears the largest chainmail piece in the film, which is a head to toe chainmail gown. Um, Shortly before his climactic scene, where he immolates himself. Um, that's it's staggering to think of how much is involved in that particular piece of work. Um, there was an aim to try and get distinctive silhouettes for each of the races and their armor, so that you could tell at a glance whether you were looking at men of Gondor, men of Rohan, the ancient Númenóreans, the elves, the orcs, the Uruk-Hai, etc., which I think is again another great idea. There's a lot of large battle sequences in this trilogy, and when you're watching a frenetic action sequence or a large battle sequence, you want to know who's who at a glance, and you want to make it easy for the audience to tell without having to recognize certain things. There were 100 sets of elven armor created for the Third Age, so that's for the scenes in the Two Towers. Um, the elves were designed to have different color schemes in the Second Age and the Third Age. So in the Third Age, they use what they called the autumn tones because it's coming towards the end of their time on Middle Earth. Lots of golds, browns, and reds. The spring tones that they used for the Second Age in the prologue of the first film. They use a lot of greens, blues, and sort of bright yellows. The elven armor was also structured in a way that made the actors pose upright in a very balletic fashion, um, in contrast to some of the other armors that would be used, which created a lot of sort of hunched looks. The actors who played orcs were generally told to be in a sort of hunched and skittering motion, especially the goblins in Moria. There were 250 suits made of the various armors of Rohan to represent both the standing soldiers in full armor with full horsehair crests, all the way down to sort of the king's bannermen who'd be wearing kind of rough leather armor. Theoden's armor was especially ornate and designed to have like um, brass. It was made of brass with like leather overlays to create the details of the finish. The Uruk-Hai, who are obviously some of the key antagonists in the film, um, were one of the first races to really be created and finalized by the crew to sort of create a benchmark for the rest of Middle Earth. They had to use full latex suits for the Uruk-Hai. So, for example, while filming the battle scene in Helm's Deep, which took several months, they had to have over 300 foam latex suits ready at any time because they had 100+ Uruk-Hai stunt actors. And obviously, those suits could get damaged and ripped, and they could only last about 6 days anyway before they'd have to be replaced with completely new prosthetics after 6 days of shooting. The Uruk-Hai also had different helmets to indicate specializations in the army, which you can note if you look at them in the battle sequence. Um, there were also tons of swords made for the film. There's over 100 different swords made and balanced as hero swords for close-ups. They were all made out of spring steel, which allows them to bend like real swords should. They also used aluminium and rubber swords for fighting and stunt work. Viggo Mortensen apparently liked to use the hero sword as often as possible while filming, because he said because it was a real sword, a real heavy steel sword, you'd get tired while you were fighting with it due to its weight. Which he said added to his performance. He even asked that Aragorn be given a whetstone prop to allow his sword to be sharpened on the road. So obviously that was then added, crafted out of a piece of silicon and added to Aragorn's costume on the request of the actor. There were over 10,000 different arrows made for the film. Some for each race. So you'd have elven arrows, orc arrows, uruk arrows, men arrows, etc. Some characters would also spend hours in makeup. Most of the Hobbit actors had to have several hours in the morning having their feet applied, as well as their ears, their wigs. John Rhys Davies, who played the role of Gimli, had several layers of latex, including a fake nose, hair pieces, ears, cheeks, etc. And apparently would react very, very badly to the makeup. Its skin flared up every day that he was filming, and so he couldn't be shot on multiple days in a row. So had to. So yeah, he'd have to film a day and then take a day off to recover, and then film another day, and so on, for the majority of the shoot. However, one little interesting fact about his makeup is it did include a latex fingertip. He'd lost a fingertip on his middle finger, on his left hand, I believe it was, as a youngster, um, and so he'd had a latex fingertip um, to restore him, so that Gimli had full use of his hands. Um, which he once used to play a prank, quite a devious little prank on Peter Jackson. The hobbits would also sometimes go through the whole rigmarole of having their feet made up, but then their feet not being shot. Sean Astin, sorry, um, actually kept a count of the days that this happened, and he said it happened 50 days across the shoot, where he'd be required to go through the makeup, but then not have his feet be in the shot. And he seems to have taken a particular ire at it. Perhaps most impressively, which I didn't realize until watching the documentary from Weta Workshop, was that Treebeard was actually a constructed animatronic, a large animatronic, obviously, um, and it was done to allow the actors Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd, playing Merry and Pippin, to interact with him. Um, his face was then later animated in post production and enhanced for his speaking parts, being able to move and emote properly. But yeah, the torso of Treebeard, a lot of the scenes you see of the hobbits sitting on him while he is walking, or him holding them in his hands, were done with a realistic live Treebeard that they created. That could actually walk around on. I say walk around. It had no real legs. It was some prop guys moving giant poles to make the thing sway. But yeah, it was that I never thought that Treebeard was actually animatronic. So reading that was very, very interesting. And yeah, it's one of those things I don't think you believe unless you saw it in action. And on the documentary, you do. You get to see it. Um, Also, one quite nifty filmmaking fact, which I couldn't find a better place to put it in this review, so I'm going to add it here. The scenes with Galadriel in Lothlorien were shot in a different frame rate to create a sort of slowed, dreamlike quality to her movements on screen. So scenes of her walking around towards her mirror are shot at 33 frames per second, which is like time and a half. Um, and then her Dark Queen speech was shot at 48 frames per second rather than the standard 24. So that when the film was played back at the appropriate 24 frames per second speed, Galadriel seems slower and more ethereal, which I thought was a great addition that you get when adapting a film, when adapting a novel into a film, and it does work to make Galadriel seem quite otherworldly. There was an entire costume department beyond Weta Workshop. Weta Workshop was responsible for creating the armor, but there was also a load of seamstresses involved in making costumes. 40 different seamstresses who made over 19,000 costumes. Each of the lead actors would have 10 of their costumes, then 10 again for their body doubles, then for their scale doubles, then for their stunt doubles. So, for example, for Frodo, any of Frodo's outfits would require 40 copies, some of which in different scales. Um, Costumes are usually designed to look worn or aged, Everything was to look lived in, not brand new. Um, there's lots and lots of hand stitching and embroidery. Seeing the footage in the documentary, you realize some of this you can't really make out on screen properly. Um, and it's incredibly impressive, and it was all done by hand as well. Saruman, for example, his outfit is not bright white. It's actually made to look sort of faded as well, but is also covered in all these lavish and intricate details, a lot of which then echo in Gandalf the White's outfit as well. Um, Aragorn's outfit is designed to look like it's been repaired by hand, like there are cuts that are then stitched with like hand stitching, um, to look like he's been repairing his own clothes as he's been wandering around as a ranger. Um, Gandalf the Grey's outfit even looks like it's going threadbare in some places, um, to echo, Gandalf sort of traveling on the road. Every actor in the film also wore a wig. I should point out there's one extra who is one of Peter Jackson's children who apparently was not wearing a wig. Every other actor is wearing a wig throughout the film, and almost every beard is false as well. Um, some of the larger false beards meant that prosthetic noses also needed to be used to accentuate the profile of characters, as you could lose their nose in the layers of fake beard. Ian McKellen, for example, in the documentary states that he has quite a prominent nose and yet still had to wear a latex prosthetic uh, to increase the size of his nose. There was also a soft workshop, which was responsible for making textile banners and tapestries for the armies. So the banners that they carry into battle, the giant textile tapestries that are on the walls of the Golden Hall in Edoras. Um, and there are also many, many details that you just don't see on screen. For example, one of Eowyn's gowns has some incredible detailing, but the scene where it's featured, she shot from the neck up. So you don't really see the gown, and then the only other scene where she's wearing the gown, she's under a large blanket that Aragorn covers her with. So yeah, the work that went into this film is incredible. Now, when it came to filming The Lord of the Rings, one of the biggest issues is the contrast of characters being different heights and different sizes. So the hobbits, for example, are said to be about 3 foot, if that, compared to a man. Sort of between 3 and 4 foot tall, compared to a full-grown man. Now, it's not enough for them to be played by I'm not sure the PC term is at the minute. Is little people actors? What used to be referred to as dwarves and midgets. But I know those aren't technically accepted by any of those communities. But little people actors who were obviously used to great success to play a lot of aliens on things like Star Trek. For example, all of the Wickets, the character, all of the Ewoks, or obviously Kenny Baker, who played R2D2. And their use in films such as Willow and Time Bandits. But I do think I agree with the decision not to use too many actors like that for Lord of the Rings. I mean, I'm not trying to diminish many little people actors. There are some incredible ones out there. But I do think the forced scale that they did in this is much more impressive, in terms of a feat of filmmaking. What they did was they employed a lot of tried and true filming techniques. Really, forced perspective being one of the main ones, where, for example, a character who should appear larger is towards the foreground of the screen, and so on. Um, and they also use scale doubles, where they did use some little people actors and some quite large people as well, as doubles for different characters while interacting with others. Um, and it does create the impression that these hobbits and Gimli as well, the dwarf, are a lot smaller than the characters they're alongside. You know, and it's very, very, very well done. They also, despite the fact that a lot of these are tried and tested methods, they did try and innovate them as well. For example, the table in Bag End, when Bilbo is pouring Gandalf tea, they created a dolly rig so that the camera could move with the forced perspective for the first time in film history. The camera would move and the table would move along with it, due to the rig that it was on. They also created large, big rig costumes for certain characters, which would be these large costumes with animatronic hands as well in a lot of cases, to walk past the hobbits. For example, there's a big rig that walks past the hobbits when they're checking into the Prancing Pony in Bree, and the hands actually move and flex as though real, as though a man is trying to gesture, saying, "Oh, sorry, can I just get through there?" Um, but it's an animatronic hand designed to look large, but it moves and gesticulates exactly like a real hand. It's very, very impressive. Um, some cases, the scale doubles might wear face masks of the actors that they're portraying, for wide shots. For example, the actor who was the scale double for Gimli. They did mention his full name in the documentaries, but I have forgotten. I believe his first name was definitely Brett. Um, he was just he was just a shorter actor who they used quite a lot for a lot of the wide shots of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli together. Um, he wore a lot of the same facial prosthetics that John Rhys Davies wore as Gimli, which gave him a look not dissimilar to Gimli. But for example, a lot of the scale doubles for the hobbits, one of them, an Indian man named Kiran Shah, um, he would wear. He was obviously a much older man and of a racial orientation that meant he didn't look like Billy Boyd or Elijah Wood or any of the other hobbits. So when he would be filming, he'd often wear a mask, like a latex mask, to resemble those actors. So, for example, when they're boating, they're on the boats, traveling down the River Anduin. He's in the boat as Pippin, wearing a face mask of Billy Boyd. And it's just incredibly impressive. Everything in the film looks very natural. There's a few scenes where you can notice the blue screen compositing, where actors have obviously been filmed on different sets, or an actor has been put in using blue screen. And there are a couple of those scenes, but it's more impressive the ones that you don't notice, I think. For example, there's a scene of Frodo walking through a door in front of Gandalf, where he's talking about getting rid of the ring, saying no one knows it's here. Elijah Wood was filmed on a blue screen and then composited into the shot of Bag End with Ian McKellen. Um, or when Gandalf first arrives at Bag End and hands his hat and staff to Bilbo, the two actors were filmed on. Well, I think Bilbo was filmed on the Bag End set with the large props, and Ian McKellen was filmed against a blue screen, and then with the props relevant to his scale. And it's pretty seamless compositing. Um, the issues where the compositing is more noticeable. I think the most noticeable example in the trilogy is when Frodo and Sam are unmasked in the ranger camp in the Two Towers, and the camera pans out as all the rangers are maneuvering around them. That was one of the more noticeable ones. For the rest of the time, it is quite seamless and quite natural, and I think it looks very impressive. Um, a lot of the actors would also, and a lot of the scale doubles would also be involved in the stunt work. There were also stunt teams trained in multiple techniques and styles to represent all of the different cultures and races. The scale doubles and a lot of the stunt actors would be considered by the principal actors almost as important in anything they were doing. The documentary is full of stories and discussions of these different, of the actors telling stories from behind the scenes, and it's very clear that the stunt team and the scale team were incorporated into all of that as well. A lot of this bonding behind the scenes, which I think is lovely. Um, the film hired swordmaster Bob Anderson. Bob Anderson has been involved in multiple films. He was Darth Vader's sword double in the original Star Wars. He was responsible for the sword choreography in The Princess Bride, and he's perhaps most famous as the stunt double of Errol Flynn. He was responsible for a lot of the sword training techniques and working with a lot of the principal actors, including the heavy training of Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn, who he described as one of the most gifted swordsmen he'd ever worked with. Viggo Mortensen was actually hired quite late into production. Originally, Stuart Townsend was cast as Aragorn before they decided that he was probably too young for the role. So when Viggo was flown into New Zealand, he literally had a week to train before he shot his first scenes, which was the battle at Weathertop, where he has to fight off 5 of the Nazgul. But apparently he took to it very, very, very well. And you can see in the final film, the battle at Weathertop, Aragorn is impressive. There were over 4 months of stunt work done for the Battle of Helm's Deep in the Two Towers. The Uruks actors playing the stunt team, the stunt team playing the Uruks. They'd actually sort of divided at some points against the stunt team doing the elves. There was almost a sort of rivalry between them to create the better scenes. At one point, apparently the actors playing the Uruks did a hacker at the newer actors the newer stunt team who were playing the elves. Viggo was often there as well, doing a lot of his own stunts, and all of the stunt actors apparently wanted to fight him. Because he gave the best fights and presented the best stunts. And yeah, the stories of all of them just bonding on the documentaries are amazing. I'm focusing in my discussion here on the filmmaking aspects, but there are so many discussions of injuries and horseplay and drinking and fishing and running jokes between the cast and crew. And if you have the DVDs for Lord of the Rings, the extended cut editions, I think that they're also available on the Blu-ray, and you haven't watched these appendices, I highly recommend it. They can be a bit dry in places. Maybe don't marathon them like I did for this podcast, but I definitely recommend watching them because some of the stories are just so lovely and endearing. And for example, why would you not want to learn why the Hobbit actors had to record the quite emotionally harrowing Grey Havens finale of Return of the King 3 times? Because that's a thing that happened, and they explain why. Um, in that novel, do you not want to know the story of what actually happened at Sam and Rosie's wedding and which of the other actors were actually there? These are things that I'm not going to spoil for you, and I highly recommend watching those documentaries if you want to find out. There's so many interesting bits in there. One fun little story which I found quite interesting was that the scenes on the Cirith Ungol stairs where Frodo sends Sam away were shot a year apart. Um, what I mean by that is the shots of coverage on Frodo were shot one day and the shots of Sam were shot another day, which is pretty standard in filmmaking. You get the coverage in different shots on different days. But in this instance, yes, they were filmed a year apart. It was because they went down to film external shots as Queenstown had flooded. And so they got a local squash court where they could do some indoor filming, and the only set that would fit on the squash court was the stairs of Cirith Ungol. So they set the set up. They filmed Frodo's half, and then the next day when they came to shoot, the weather was brilliant. And in that run up to Christmas, the weather carried on being brilliant, so they carried on shooting outside while they could. Using the good weather to do all the external flooding. External flooding to do all the external filming, all the location filming. And then eventually having to come back, and they left the stairs of Cirith Ungol set up on a squash court in a hotel for a whole year, waiting for the actors and filmmakers to return to film the other half of this scene. The first half also being shot even before Andy Serkis was cast as Gollum. Being filmed while they were filming The Fellowship of the Ring. Because Andy Serkis was actually cast quite late, which I'll go into in a bit. Now, I said before, one of the big parts of filming Lord of the Rings was the bigatures, as they came to be coined by Weta Workshop. The bigatures were essentially large miniatures created for things like Isengard, Khazad-dûm, Rivendell, Lothlorien, Helm's Deep, Minas Tirith, etc. That could then be used in camera for long and detailed shots. And they were called bigatures because while they were built to a certain scale, they were still large. They were enormous. And, model shots and digital doubles could be used alongside them to create the detailed thing. So, for example, Helm's Deep, for example, the shots of the Deeping Wall and Theoden and Aragorn walking the battlements as all the men are guarding them. Part of that was shot on a real set, which was then imposed on the shots taken of the miniature, with digital creations being used at the bottom for soldiers milling around and getting ready. And it's very, very impressive. They also created a digital camera which they could use in a 3D set. So, for example, on the motion capture studio, There's shots in the documentaries of Peter Jackson wired up with a VR camera, a digital camera, which he was then able to pose in the 3D version of the set of Balin's tomb for the cave troll battle, so he could decide where the camera was going for the digital aspects of the battle. Um, there were many other digital programs. I'm going to talk on one of them in a minute, which is called Massive. But they also used, for example, a small program known as Grove, which was used to dress the Ents with variations of leaves and branches. But to go back to the bigatures, they were also worked in with the logistic as to how they could exist and how that would inform the design. So, for example, something like the Argonaths, the giant statues that are before the Falls of Rauros of the ancient kings of men standing with their hands out. Their lower parts are carved from the mountainside and then, directly, and then their higher upper bodies are built out of bricks, and the miniature includes a quarry next to the Argonaths where these bricks would have been would have been hewn from the stone and then carried over and constructed into the Argonaths. Something like Minas Morgul, which was a former human city, and how it's been captured and taken by the orcs, and been sort of perverted. A tower like the Tower of Orthanc, being created with its top to match Sauron's staff and to be looking like it's been made out of sort of obsidian, like chunks of obsidian, like volcanic glass almost. Some very interesting things, and it helps with realizing these fantastical locations on film because they're real. You're looking at them. These aren't CGI creations; they are real. The entire Tower of Barad-dûr, for example, was constructed in a 166th scale. But they built the entire tower. It was inside a large room, but it's the entire Tower of Barad-dûr. Helm's Deep they constructed in multiple different scales for different shots. Fangorn Forest they even built a miniature for, as 60 square foot plates. A series of plates that encompass 60 square feet that could be shuffled and moved around to create different long shots for the forest, which they could then animate Treebeard in. Some things were then done practically with the miniatures as well. So, for example, there's a tower in Osgiliath, which is hit by a large rock catapulted from the orc side, and they did that practically, as well as the breaking of the dam in Isengard, or the pouring out of the skulls in the Dimholt Road. And it's phenomenally impressive watching these things and seeing them all done for real. The Blackgate miniature was a miniature that actually opened. The gates, the Black Gate itself opens up on the miniature. There were different lighting schemes used for Minas Morgul. So, for example, it even included glowing paint, so that it could be lit with a UV light to give it what was called the corpse-like glow that it's described to have in the book. The Paths of the Dead, the Dimholt Road, features 60,000 miniature skulls that are unleashed as it breaks. The miniature for Minas Tirith features over 1,000 different houses. all arranged and placed within the city. The miniatures team apparently shot for over 1,000 days of the production. They had parties as they were filming. On the 250th day, the 500th day, the 666th day, they had a devil themed party. Some footage of which makes its way into the documentary and looks like it was a hell of a lot of fun. And when I say miniatures, they were also responsible for building, for example, a life-size dead mama kill, complete with 600 arrows in it, for background shots in the aftermath of Pelennor Fields. And Weta Workshop had their party, the staff party, after shooting it, and they even took their cast photo on it. It's I personally found, while I was watching the documentaries, as interesting as some of the aspects of the filmmaking were, and Weta's efforts were incredible. The miniature documentaries were some of my favorite. As you may have seen, as you may have seen if you've ever checked out my Instagram, through the links that I have, or as you may have gathered from my Warhammer episode, I'm a fan of miniature modeling, and I was looking at these miniatures and thinking, I know how to build stuff like that. I've seen stuff like that at Warhammer World in Nottingham. The Warhammer World, the guys behind Warhammer Games Workshop, they even did a Lord of the Rings miniature game, and they have a whole range of Lord of the Rings models. They have done since the films were released. The designers of the Lord of the Rings miniature game even cameo in the Battle of Pelennor Fields in full costume as warriors of Rohan. Now, they have miniatures for their battle game, and they've actually created miniature dioramas and stuff for the Lord of the Rings game. You go into Warhammer World in Nottingham in the United Kingdom, and there is a Battle of Pelennor Fields display downstairs with the Riders of Rohan, the Orcs, the Mumakil, everything. So I found the miniature documentaries especially fascinating. I heartily recommend watching those if you have any interest in miniatures, and just being able to realize them and seeing them in shot. I think totally adds to the film, because you can see these miniatures there. I mean, these films came out in the early 2000s. CGI was not as advanced as it is now. But even then, we're going to talk about the CGI now. One of the developers at Weta Digital created a program called Massive. Now, Massive is used as a program for the battle sequences within these films. Essentially, what Massive does is it creates advanced AI behavior for all of the combatants in the army battles, allowing each of the characters, who is described as an agent, to have realistic reactions with both opponents and obstacles. So they will find the nearest opponent, they will interact with their allies, they will maneuver over obstacles or around obstacles as and when necessary. All of the agents have the ability to see and hear, and while running the program, you can even zoom in and view through the eyes of all the different agents to see what the agents themselves are processing. The programming would allow them to attack, react, block, seek new targets. You could set the intelligence level of the different agents, so to reflect their martial skill. So, they could block effectively or not, as the case may be. Agents could also have randomly generated or adjusted variables, which would allow each agent to be physically different in height, build, gait, motion, creating a whole load of amazing pieces of footage. And again, it's only through watching the documentary, like with Treebeard, that you realise just how much of this film is CGI. A lot of scenes feature agents created through Massive in close-up, walking past the camera or in motion past the camera. And you realise just how impressive that software is. You know, the shots of the orcs bearing down on Helm's Deep. You know, there was a large team of orc stunt actors, but the actions of them marching into the valley towards Helm's Deep, those shots are pretty much all done with Massive. There are a few done with the actual stunt team, but a lot of the wide shots featuring large amounts of the army done with Massive. The charge of the Rohirrim in Return of the King, large parts of it done with Massive. It's very, very impressive piece of kit. I would love to know what else it's been used for. I'd imagine most things Weta Digital have worked on probably uses a lot of it. So King Kong, I know Weta Digital also have been involved in a lot of the Marvel features, so it wouldn't surprise me to learn that Massive has been used for some of the battle sequences, for example, in Endgame or Infinity War, both of which Weta Digital were involved with. But yes, it's definitely impressive. I'd love to know if it had been used for any video games as well. I'd imagine a lot of strategy games, if they used programming from Massive, would be incredible. I know it's not a genre I particularly play myself, but I'd imagine watching those games would be impressive if they were used with Massive. So yeah, the development of Massive and the creation of these agents within allowed them to use multiple close shots of CGI creations within camera. Some shots were even attempted in Massive before they attempted them on set with the stunt team, to see if they could do it in Massive first. And it's very impressive. Two Towers, for example, had 73 minutes of its total runtime involving visual effects, and some of that uses Massive. Quite a lot of it uses Massive, to be fair. Between the films, a lot of the post-production visual effects work was done after the film had released. So, for example, the Two Towers visual effects work was done within the year between Fellowship of the Ring's release and Two Towers' release, and then the same for Return of the King. Now, Weta Digital doubled its team for the second film, and I think increased the team again for Return of the King. They did do some things practically. Not everything was Massive. For example, the Charge of the Rohirrim also features shots of over 250 horses and riders charging into battle. Several horses were also used realistically in across the film, and several of them that were specially trained for the film were bought after filming. So Viggo Mortensen bought his own horse, Brago. I've forgotten the actual horse's name, but he played the character of Brago. And he even bought Arwen's horse for Arwen's riding double, who wanted to buy him but couldn't afford to because he was a stallion. So Viggo bought it and gave it to her as a gift, which I find lovely. There's plenty of stories of Viggo Mortensen being awesome throughout these films. You get the feeling he was a bit of the heart and soul of the whole production. Helped, I think, by how many scenes Aragorn is pivotal in, and how many storylines he's pivotal in, and how many people he interacts with. Um, there were more and more visual effects needed by Weta Digital as the series continued, though. Fellowship of the Ring features 540 visual effects shots. The Two Towers features 799, and then Return of the King featured 1,488 different visual effects shots. Return of the King was Massive's probably their greatest achievement. The entire Battle of Pelennor Fields was shot within Massive. Well, I mean, obviously there were real play elements used, but a lot of the larger scenes of the battle were done within Massive. There were 350,000 different agents used for the Pelennor Fields effects. 200,000 orcs, the men of Minas Tirith, the army of the dead, etc. As well as the men of Harad and the Mumakil. Alan Lee helped to create the virtual environment based on his own knowledge of Middle-earth. He was quite heavily involved with Weta Digital creating the environment of the Pelennor Fields, based on things that he'd done in his paintings before, as well as in different concept arts. They built a virtual landscape made up of location shots to create a sort of virtual miniature that a camera could be manipulated within, in the same way that they would use the bigatures to manipulate a real camera. Massive was used to program all the agents. So there's 200,000 orcs, 6,000 Rohirrim, which included motion capture of horses doing 450 different motions, so that all the horses act in the same way that the standard humanoid agents do. And that's in comparison to the 10,000 Uruk-Hai that we used at Helm's Deep. So that just shows you just how huge the scale of the Pelennor Fields battle is. Peter Jackson even suggested that visual effects supervisor Jim Rigel shoot the real horses for the Battle of Pelennor Fields, so that he could more closely match the pre-visualization and the real effect shots that they knew that they needed. The collapse of Barad-dûr as well also used a digital model. So someone made a digital model based on the miniature that had been created, and created it over his Christmas break one year, as almost kind of a labor of love to make sure that Barad-dûr collapsed effectively. The visual effects crew had their monthlies screened every month. Monthlies comes from the term of like all the shots that had been completed in that month were screened for the crew every month, so they could see the work that they'd been working on and see what it would actually look like on screen, which I think is a great idea, to let them see what they've done as they're going along. The final month of production apparently featured 40 minutes of work. That's the final month of production on Return of the King. It's very, very impressive, the visual effects stuff in this film. Lord of the Rings still looks better than a lot of films that have come out since, and I think a large portion of that is the effort that went into it, and a large part of it is a lot of the real world references that they had. A lot of things like orc armor was created realistically, and then that realistic prop could be used on the digital creation, and it just makes everything more believable, I think. Same with the miniatures, the bigatures, etc. There's a lot more elements to the production. There was multiple filming units throughout most of the production. Most films usually run with a secondary unit that is responsible for things that the first unit can't do. But there was not just a secondary unit on Lord of the Rings. Quite often there was 5 or 7 filming units, with each of which had multiple cameras, so that things could be done, to sort of streamline the process. Differing shooting units were able to link via satellite so that Jackson could observe, even if he was not technically with that shooting unit, if he was in a different area of New Zealand. Altogether, the film shot 5 million feet of film, 70% of which got printed. So printing film is where you are actually seriously considering it and taking it to the editing suite, etc. Editing equipment even ended up being taken to location at times, so that editing could be done while the film was shooting. Each film had its own editor. That was a decision Peter Jackson made quite early on. John Gilbert does the editing for Fellowship, Mike Horton for The Two Towers, and longtime Peter Jackson collaborator James Selkirk, who worked with him throughout most of his independent film career, does The Return of the King. There were multiple takes done for this film, and we're talking double figures for takes, as Jackson directed each line of the film that he was shooting, quite often leading to a variety of different takes, as he'd ask the actors to say the line differently or put the emphasis on a different word, etc. And a lot of actors were, especially the more experienced actors, were unused to this. Christopher Lee commented that he usually does a film in sort of 3 or 4 takes, and he's like, I think we've got this. And Ian McKellen said, oh no, I didn't shoot the other day and it got to 24 takes. So it's a very particular style of filmmaking, but I think it requires a lot of work, but I do think it's definitely helps, because again, this film is a masterpiece. There'd be sometimes the dailies of what was being filmed could be 3 to 4 hours long. So the crew would be watching the dailies back, and there could be hours of dailies from multiple different takes, multiple different camera angles, multiple different filming units. One particular day in the production, I don't think they ever specified what day it was, but they had 50,000 feet of film, which equates to 8 hours. As a result of this, obviously Jackson couldn't personally oversee every daily. Usually the director is quite heavily involved with the dailies to make sure he's got what he needed. Jackson couldn't necessarily see every single daily for this film and film the film because of how much effort it took, how much time that would have taken. So, for example, something like Boromir's death, his death scene was cut by the editor and then presented to Peter Jackson, and Peter Jackson said, yeah, that's fine, that's perfect, put it in the film. They tried to focus the cut for the first movie especially on the story of Frodo and the Ring, and take out a lot of superfluous scenes. New Line, Robert Shea had cut privileges, but apparently did not interfere in the cut. So the final theatrical cut is entirely Jackson's cut. So the extended cut isn't necessarily a director's cut in the same way that a lot of other directors' cuts were, where the directors put back things that they wanted to include in the movie, but for whatever reason were forced to remove, usually by studio interference. A good example being the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League, which is, him showing his version of the movie, or James Cameron's director's cut of Aliens, which includes scenes that he wanted to include for storyboard and script, such as the scenes with the sentry guns or the acknowledgement of Ellen Ripley's daughter. But those scenes are taken out of the theatrical cut because they do extend it quite significantly and slow it down in certain points of the film. The extended cut isn't that. in the same way. It's not a director's cut in the same way as those. But what it does is it adds more of the scenes from the book, for the extra subplots and characters, um, that detract from the focus of Frodo and the Ring. Aragorn especially gets a lot of extended scenes in the extended cuts, especially in Fellowship, and a lot of the scenes for the extended cuts were then touched up as needed, before, after the theatrical cut had been delivered, for the DVDs. The extended cut videos and DVDs, when they were released in the November, before the next film. So Fellowship released December 2001. Its extended cut didn't release until November 2002. About a month before the release of Two Towers. And then same for Two Towers and Return of the King. It was the November after their release that those extended cuts released, after existing DVD and video prints had already released. So the extended cut would be quite often worked on alongside the score for the next film while Peter Jackson was in London with Howard Shaw. Two Towers was edited by Jackson, editing each story arc at a time and then working on intercutting them together, to make the narrative flow better. Actors would tend to be brought in for pickups after the rough cut was previewed amongst the filmmakers, as they could decide what was necessary to develop the plot or how to make scenes better. This is also where they might decide that maybe an extra visual effects shot needed to be done, or sometimes an extra miniature shot. They might take the miniatures out of storage and do an extra shot for them. And Two Towers, when they went into it, they thought might be the most difficult to edit, but Return of the King was apparently a much busier edit. For Two Towers, they had to lock roughly 5.5 minutes of the cut every day of post-production to reach the delivery day, which included score, visual effects, sound mixing, and the edit, all being done at the same time and mostly in the final minutes. So, a lot of late nights where Jackson would be working with one aspect of production and then do a teleconference for several hours, to do more of the editing and post-production work. The first round of pickups and reshoots was done for all of the films together, as I said, on Stone Street, with 7 units shooting pretty much 24/7, and actors flitting between sets and scenes from across the trilogy. Viggo Mortensen says on one day of pickup shoots, he underwent 8 costume changes, as he moved from different sets. The final pickups were then done after that, in between film releases, with less of a rush than during the principal photography or principal reshoots. A lot of actors got gifted with props or costumes on their final days. Viggo Mortensen was given a haka by the stunt team and shared a headbutt with each of them, which would become a bit of a ritual between them during his interactions with the stunt team. Jackson himself felt that he was getting down to the wire on editing Return of the King, and so made time to edit the ending over a 3-week period, in the middle of post-production, so that the ending of the film wouldn't be rushed. So he locked that sort of final reel of the film relatively early on. Several scenes ended up begrudgingly being cut just because they weren't working in the final cut, such as the scene with Saruman that I mentioned earlier, which was already a holdover because it didn't feel right in Two Towers. The film also uses digital colour grading to generate a sort of fantasy quality throughout the entire film, actually. But whereas nowadays we tend to think of more sort of digital colour grading as like grayscale filters or sort of the washed out look that you get in a lot of movies nowadays that use digital film. It was a criticism of a lot of the early Marvel films, is that the digital film made everything look a bit washed out. Whereas Lord of the Rings is very vibrant. A lot of the film has different scaling for areas and shots. The elves especially benefit from the digital grading. You know, they're allowed to be, they can be made much brighter. A lot of their colours more vibrant. About 70% of the film uses the digital colour grading of some manner of changing. It also allows shots from different cameras to match. So shots of miniatures, shots of locations, shots of sets, shots of everything could all be blended together using the digital grading. And yeah, there's a lot of changes that they made. For example, Hobbiton uses a lot of colour grading shifted towards the magenta end of the spectrum to make everything feel warmer and relaxed, which I think is nice. The final part of crafting the film was the score. The score was done by Howard Shore. Howard Shore has been a composer in the music industry in the film industry, for a long time. He's been involved in several amazing films, but I do think his work on Lord of the Rings is possibly his best. He was involved as a composer for several years, as opposed to the normal 6 to 8 weeks that composers usually work. I think he was involved for 4 years all told. He visited the set quite early on, was involved afterwards, right the way through until conclusion of editing on Return of the King. Apparently, he had nearly 8,000 takes of different music recordings across the trilogy. He used a lot of choirs and other voices. There was a Polynesian male voice choir that were used to sing Dwarvish in one of the songs. Enya, the Celtic singer, composed Nerion, which was the theme song for Aragorn and Arwen. He used a large mix of influences in creating the music. So, for example, Lothlorien uses Indian and African instruments, so that nothing can really be nailed down to a particular culture, but does feel to have a cultural history all of its own. The score for all three films uses a lot of distinct themes and leitmotifs to permeate the score. For example, The Fellowship has a very strong theme and leitmotif that runs through a lot of their scenes, and also scenes in the Shire. The Ring has several leitmotifs, both for its power and its more seductive elements. There's leitmotifs for Rohan, for Gondor, for the Ring Wraiths, all of which permeate the entire trilogy. Sometimes with accompanying poems written by Philippa Boyens or Fran Walsh, quite often taken from the novels and the novel, or and restructured into one of the languages that Tolkien created. Several themes approach different music styles to create sort of unsettling feelings. For example, Isengard has a 5/4 structure to represent its industry, which is a more unnatural sound. Howard Shore viewed approaching the score to these films like creating an opera, with certain parts echoing across the trilogy. So, for example, the Gondor theme gets previewed in the Council of Elrond when Boromir is talking about his father, which I believe is in the extended cut, before then appearing in Return of the King quite prominently during all the scenes set in Minas Tirith. The theme of the Ring Wraiths includes a poem by Philippa Boyens. It was translated into Adunaic, which is the ancient language of men. Peter Jackson wanted the theme for Rohan to be hummable. So Howard Shore complied, and Fran Walsh actually commented to Peter Jackson the day that he did indeed start humming it. Many of the actors sing in the film. Viggo Mortensen, Miranda Otto, and Billy Boyd all sing as part of their performances in the film. For Miranda Otto, she's singing in the language of Rohan, and she's singing sort of a prayer over Theodred's funeral, which only appears in the extended cut, but I find is a nice touch. For Aragorn, he's singing the sort of almost like a pledge of the ancient kings of Numenor when they arrived in the land of Gondor. So essentially, it's like a promise that his ancestor would have made. Billy Boyd's song is sung in Denethor's court. It's the only one of the three that's sung in English. Liv Tyler also sings a song that was meant to be used over one of Arwen's scenes, but never was, and so remained unused for a long time before finally appearing in the extended cut, sung over the Houses of Healing scene in Return of the King. The concluding song to the whole trilogy is Into the West, a song sung by Annie Lennox, who Howard Shore had wanted to work with for years. The lyrics for it were inspired by Cameron Duncan, who was a young filmmaker from New Zealand and a friend of Jackson and Walsh, who died of a terminal illness during the filming of Return of the King. And musical refrains from Into the West do actually appear over a lot of scenes in Return of the King, whenever characters are addressing death or discussing death. So, for example, it plays the scenes in the Grey Havens. It plays when Pippin and Gandalf talk about what waits beyond death, as well as several other scenes. Ringwraiths were given their quite unusual scream, which was the scream of writer Fran Walsh. Peter Jackson pointed out that she could scream like that, so she did. Due to an interesting quirk of fate, 98% of the film had to have its dialogue re-recorded by ADR. The warehouses where they were filming in Wellington were not far from the airport, meaning that for a lot of the daily footage, there was planes going overhead. And so a lot of the audio then had to be recreated later on. This also meant quite heavy sessions of Foley as well, as a lot of the sound would need to be redone. So every step needed to be redone. Even simple things like an arrow firing required about 6 different sound effects that had to be layered together through Foley. There's also some interesting sound facts. A cricket crowd at Wellington was used for the Uruks at Helm's Deep. Their Mumakil were deliberately made not to sound like elephants, because elephants are quite gentle animals that people care for. So they were given noises such as lion roars and horses in heat to make them sound scary and threatening, so that we didn't object to these giant elephantine monsters being killed on screen. They also had quite booming footsteps, so to stop the audio overwhelm, the sound mixers only put sound on their front footsteps while the Mumakil are marching. Otherwise, it would have been cacophonic. The skulls in the Dimholt were recorded using rented walnuts, because, as they say in the documentary, apparently you can rent walnuts in Wellington. For the sounds of the trebuchet and catapults in Return of the King, the sound mixers actually dropped a 2-ton concrete block off of a 60-foot crane repeatedly first onto the ground and then onto different things to create different sound effects. Um, the sound design in the Smeagol flashback was actually used instead of the score to highlight the evil of the ring. They used different echo effects and heartbeats and other things like that. The new studio was actually being built around the sound mixing team in Wellington as they mixed Return of the King. And again, everything was down to the wire. So music, visual effects, sound, editing, and final pickups were all being finalized in those final few months. And it actually looked for a while like Return of the King might have to be delayed. The edit might change, which could affect all factors such as music cues Howard Shore was using, etc. So tensions were running high right towards the end there, but everyone wanted to put their best into it. And despite the fact it might not look that it might make the delivery date, the final reel of the film was locked a few days before the world premiere of Return of the King, which is incredible to think that it was running that late. I'm not sure I'm especially proud of all the crunch that must have happened for those teams. There are some shots in the documentaries of some tensions and tempers flaring as some of the disagreements happen. But yeah, it's hard to deny the work that's on screen. Perhaps the most important part of the entire trilogy, and definitely one of the most important aspects, one of the most influential aspects culturally of the entire film, is Gollum. Gollum is a very, very interesting character who's at the core of Lord of the Rings. He is someone who's had the ring for 500 years and has been corrupted by its evil. And Gollum is one of the most central, sympathetic characters of the entire story, while also being a despicable villain. He only ever wants the ring for himself. He doesn't want to use it for power. He doesn't ever want to try and corrupt the world with it. He just wants to sit with it in a cave in the middle of nowhere and covet it. His precious, as he calls the ring. So as a result, Peter Jackson said that Gollum was one thing that he wanted to get right. As one of the most important pieces of the entire story. He said if we got Frodo wrong, yes, it'd be a shame, but people could probably forgive it. If they got Gollum wrong, the entire thing wouldn't work. And I have to kind of agree with him. I think Gollum is so important, but I think they did a good job. Gollum went through 200 different drawings and 100 maquettes before they got a design finalized. Weta Digital were determined to prove to New Line that they could do Gollum and keep him in-house. They didn't want Gollum to be farmed off to another production studio, another visual effects workshop. And it was lip sync tests using the approved Gollum that got them the job. They proved that they first did an animatic of an action sequence, and that wasn't really convincing New Line. But then they did a lip sync test and proved that the model they designed for Gollum could not only emote but could do a convincing performance, and that got them to keep the job. However, it was the audition of Andy Serkis which I think changed a lot of the direction of what happened with Gollum. Andy Serkis's audition proved to Peter Jackson that the full acting of the part of Gollum was necessary. Originally, they were looking just for a voice actor, but Andy Serkis's audition. I mean, if you've ever seen Andy Serkis perform Gollum in interviews or anything, you see how he performs Gollum. It's not just a voice. He leans into it. He becomes Gollum. You know, there's a scene of him on one of the late shows in America, Stephen Colbert, I think, and he's reading lines from tweets from Donald Trump in Gollum's voice. But to do the role of Gollum, he sits and squats up on the chair and becomes the character, and it's so impressive. And this led to Peter Jackson bringing Andy Serkis out to New Zealand, bringing him onto set for Gollum to actually act. And Andy Serkis does. He puts a lot of effort into the role of Gollum. For example, there's the scene in Two Towers where Gollum chases a fish down a small rocky stream. Andy Serkis actually did that, leapt over all those stones in the exact same way, dragging himself on his torso, exactly the same way that Gollum does in the film. You know, it was a physical job. It was demanding on his voice, but his energy created the character. Gollum ended up being completely redesigned again after Serkis's acting to better match his face, but corrupted by the ring, which I think helped when Andy Serkis played the role of Smeagol in the flashback, because they were able to see Andy Serkis in Hobbit makeup and change that face into Gollum. However, it did mean that they had to rebuild like 2 years of work in the year between Fellowship and Two Towers' releases. Gollum's performance was then redone on the motion capture stage. So he had to recreate a lot of his scenes on the motion capture stage, including his song, which was originated by Serkis, the song of him catching the fish. Motion capture was an almost completely new technique at the time. I don't think many films had used it. I think it had been used, but definitely not much. And to use it to the extent that The Lord of the Rings did, I think was almost unheard of. Some of the animations still needed to be tweaked with keyframing to sort of combine the two styles of traditional visual effects animation, traditional computer animation, and motion capture animation. So, for example, the motion capture only includes like the posing of the limbs, not the posing of the fingers, the hands. So that would have to be done with traditional animation. Quite often, the visual effects team actually rotoscoped Gollum, or roto-animated, I suppose, over the in-camera performance of Andy Serkis. Each of the shots with Gollum were actually shot twice, once with Andy Serkis in frame and then one with Andy Serkis out of frame, with the actors essentially miming the role. So Elijah Wood and Sean Bean would be acting, but Gollum wouldn't be there. Which is how they intended to do the film at first. But what they often found was that the plates, the film plates that they shot with Serkis tended to be the better performances, and you had the real interaction between the three actors, which improved the performance. And they'd have to find a way to make those work. They'd have to interact. For example, there's a fight scene between Sam and Gollum, which was acted out by Sean Astin and Andy Serkis. And in the fight, Andy Serkis headbutts, does like a fake headbutt towards Sean Astin, which causes him to reel back. But then the animation team decided they wanted Gollum to sort of like climb onto Sam in kind of an inhuman way, which obviously Andy Serkis wouldn't have been able to do because he's much larger. Has a much larger frame than Gollum does. But then, of course, the headbutt didn't make sense, so they had to work out, well, what is Sam reacting to that knocks his head back? And they used a hand. They used Gollum grabbing his hair and sort of wrestling his head, which I thought was a great way of doing it. It's good. It's good stopgap motion to use the footage. I mean, they did still shoot mind plates for some other aspects. For example, the battle with Shelob uses mind plates, where Sean Astin is essentially just acting against nothing because they couldn't exactly build a scale model of Shelob or use an actor to come in and do it. Although I did think that, do you think they used part of Shelob, like Shelob's mandibles? But it's nothing done to the same extent that they could do with Gollum. Sometimes renders would be done overnight for dailies, and they might come in the morning and find that something had gone wrong with the renders, like Gollum's hair standing straight up on end, or his hands being bent at obscene angles, or things like that, which did happen. They show some of these outtakes in the documentaries, but I think Andy Serkis's Gollum became so iconic, and I think it's hard to argue that we'd have a lot of the CGI characters and creatures that we see nowadays without Gollum. I don't think we could see Thanos, for example, without Gollum. Towards the end of filming, some of the final scenes they did for the pickups actually did the motion capture suit while filming the scene. So the motion capture of Gollum's performance would be done as the scene was being filmed. So that Andy Serkis wouldn't have to recreate those scenes on the motion capture stage because they'd already be done. The motion capture would already be there. And that's so incredible. Gollum really was a standout piece of film history that I think Lord of the Rings will always be known for. And the performance is incredible. Even though Gollum is CGI, you never once watching it think this isn't a real character. The performance is there. The visual is there. And some of Gollum's best scenes are scenes of him talking, like the almost schizophrenic argument that he has between his Gollum and Smeagol personas is iconic, and it was all accomplished in camera by Andy Serkis and then animated by the animators based on that visual performance. So yeah, I have a lot of respect for Gollum and the effect he had on filmmaking. There's no wonder he went on to become as beloved as he did, and Andy Serkis deserves every success for his work as Gollum and the other CGI characters he's played since, such as King Kong and Caesar. There's a reason why he is the person playing so many of these roles. There's a reason why he is there, for example, giving actors like Josh Brolin and Mark Ruffalo tips in the Marvel Universe to improve their performance, because he knows what he's doing. He knows what he's talking about. And Gollum's performance is so good because Andy Serkis was so good. It's like even things like, Gollum literally scrabbling around on all fours over rocks and stuff. It's because Andy Serkis is a mountaineer. He's been mountaineering since he was a young man. So that he actually climbs rocks in his spare time. So Gollum does the same thing, and it's all there on camera. And the performance he put in, it was absolutely incredible. and seeing the behind the scenes footage of him actually acting, these very physically demanding things. It's very, very impressive. So, as I said, Lord of the Rings released in 2001. December 10th, 2001 is when Fellowship of the Ring released. The city of Wellington in New Zealand even changed its name to Middle Earth for a day when Fellowship premiered to honour the making of the entire film trilogy there. Fellowship of the Ring, I think, kind of flew under the radar a little bit. It wasn't the most successful film that year. Instead, Harry Potter was, because Philosopher's Stone also released that same year. Harry Potter, I'm not a huge fan of Harry Potter anyway, but I do think that first film has aged spectacularly poorly, especially when compared to Lord of the Rings. If you compare, for example, the troll sequences, there's a troll in the bathrooms in Harry Potter. That troll is just bad CGI. Like, even at the time, it's bad CGI. And then you compare it to the cave troll that was used in the Battle of Moria in Fellowship, and it's night and day. It really, really is. The cave troll is so much better in Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings, I think, has just aged so much better. Two Towers, however, was a much, much bigger deal when it released. Apparently towards the end of its theatrical run, Fellowship even included a brief trailer for the Two Towers. Towards the end of its theatrical run, I never saw that version of the film. Fellowship made $47.2 million in its opening weekend in the US, and made over $897 million worldwide. Two Towers smashed that with $62 million in its first US weekend, and then $947 million worldwide. And then Return of the King went on to beat that again. Getting 72.6 million in its first US weekend, and then became the second film after Titanic to gross over $1 billion worldwide. And it went on to make 1.146 billion worldwide, which is, even today, that would be a very, very impressive amount. More and more films make over $1 billion nowadays. But even today, over $1 billion is still impressive. Back in 2003, like I said, it was only the second film to do it. This was practically unheard of. And all three films were made for a budget of roughly $281 million. Because all three films were shot together, so a lot of elements of the production could be carried over into the next film, which means they average out about sort of $93 million a piece, which is quite modest for a blockbuster nowadays. Expensive for the time, but a very, very modest amount. And the films went on to have enormous widespread acclaim, and they're ranked among among the greatest film trilogy ever made. People describe them as, one of the most ambitious and phenomenally successful dream projects of all time. Los Angeles Times said the trilogy will not soon, if ever, find its equal. They're incredible. They really, really are. They went on to receive Oscar nominations as well. Fellowship of the Ring earned 13 nominations, which was the most of any film at the time. and won 4 of them. Two Towers won 2 awards from its 6 nominations, and Return of the King won every category it was nominated in at the 76th Academy Awards, setting the current Oscar record for the highest clean sweep, with its 11 Academy Award wins, tying along with Ben-Hur and Titanic. But yeah, the highest clean sweep Oscars. Return of the King also became only the second sequel to win the Oscar for Best Picture after The Godfather Part 2. In addition to that, though, members of the production crew won the Academy Award for Technical Achievement for the rendering of skin textures on creatures in Return of the King, and Stephen Regulus won the Academy Award for Scientific and Engineering for the design and development of the Massive program. So yeah. The official world premiere for Return of the King was even held in Wellington, New Zealand. 145,000 people, according to estimates, turned out to see the parade that the cast and crew undertook from Parliament towards the theatre. And apparently the showing at the theatre was the first time that Peter Jackson actually saw the final cut in its entirety, due to just how frenetic the edit was. Like I said, it was only a few days beforehand that they'd actually delivered the film to New Line. There was a world tour off the back of the Return of the King premiere, premieres around the world. One of the final ones was actually in Oslo, and Viggo Mortensen and co-producer Rick Paris speak about this on the documentary, and they say that there was only Rick, the two of them, as well as Andy Serkis and Bernard Hill, in attendance. But apparently the premiere took place in an arena, and the premiere opened with 200 actors reenacting the highlights of the first 2 films live on stage. And they were all just fans, like actors and stunt people, but they were all fans who were just doing it. They weren't being paid for it. They just rehearsed for 6 months and did it just because they loved Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. The final Oscars season for Return of the King and led to it getting wins after all of its previous nominations. The wins were, in previous years, Fellowship and Two Towers had won awards for like cinematography and score and, more sort of technical categories. But Return of the King, like I said, it swept the awards, won every category it had been nominated for, including Best Picture, Best Director. And the entire cast and crew who were there went to the party afterwards, hosted by the OneRing.net fan community. I believe most of the charter members of OneRing.net are credited in Return of the King as well. The final shot of Return of the King actually was filmed after the Oscars party. They got some of the more skull shots for the Paths of the Dead that were used in the extended cut, and that was officially the final shot, but it actually took place weeks after the Oscars party. Yeah, for a lot of people, this was 7 or 8 years' work of their life. But for most of them, it would still have been 2 to 5 years' work, for most of the actors and such. And everyone interviewed in the documentary said, even though there might be some negatives to being associated with a project for that long, and none of them seem to look on the production negatively. Everyone seems really proud of their work and their investment on it, on The Lord of the Rings, and I think it shows in the final work. And even in the productions of the documentaries, hearing everyone talk about it, how everyone seems proud to have been a part of this. Lord of the Rings, the film as well, is, I think it did for film what the original novel did for literature in some ways, in that proving there was an adult audience for fantasy stories. Tolkien described it as, an adult fairy tale. That's how he described the Lord of the Rings, an adult fairy tale. And it really is that sort of high concept fantasy story, and proof that people will watch a long movie if it's good, if it's rewarding, which is something we're also seeing now with the Marvel films. Or I think some people did shy away from longer films after Avatar was released, which was a long film that didn't really do much. Whereas Lord of the Rings has a lot going on. Lord of the Rings, I don't think ever feels like it's dragging when you watch it. And especially if you want to watch all three of the movies, the extended cuts, as most people have nowadays. It's a long time investment. It's 11 hours of film, but it never drags, or very rarely does. You might feel like a slight drag, but then everything picks up again very quickly. And everything is realized on screen in a way that makes the whole world of Middle Earth feel real and believable. There's very few criticisms of these films. There are some, sure. One common criticism is that the film has too many endings. But originally it had more. They filmed some of the appendix things, saying what would happen to Legolas and Gimli and things like that. But every one of those endings feels earned. And even then, rewatching it, I don't think there are too many endings. I think the only way you could say that is if you see all the endings after the "You Bow to No One" in Minas Tirith as superfluous. Because that is essentially the earned ending, isn't it? That's where Aragorn gets crowned king, and he says, after Frodo's been saved and rescued, and everyone in Gondor bows to the hobbits, and that is definitely the earned ending. That is the natural conclusion for a lot of the story arcs. The only way you could then argue that the other endings are too many endings is if there's too much going on, but there's only 15 minutes of the film left at that point. I actually timed it. 15 minutes of the actual film before the end credit title card that actually says "the end." And within those 15 minutes, we see the hobbits return to the Shire. We see Sam marry Rosie. We see Frodo finishing the Red Book of Westermarch, and talking about how his wound never really healed. And we see Frodo, Galadriel, Celeborn, Elrond, and Gandalf, as well as Bilbo, go off in the boat from the Grey Havens. Now, the Grey Haven scene especially is the final ending, and it's quite long. The other bits are a bit of a montage, almost. And when I say the Grey Havens is long, it's not to its detriment. It's earned. It's a powerful emotional goodbye for these final characters, a conclusion to Bilbo's story and to Frodo's. And then after that, we see Sam return to Bag End with his wife and children. And yeah, I don't think there are too many endings. Every ending feels earned. It feels like a consequence of one of more emotional arcs or character arcs within the trilogy. Sam and Rosie is something that's hinted at very early on in Fellowship. And it's something mentioned by Sam throughout Return of the King as well, saying, if I get back, I'm going to ask that woman to marry me. So we see that he does, and it's lovely, it's beautiful. I think the film as well, because of its use of eucatastrophe that's in the story, has so much emotional power to it. Things like the arrival of Gandalf at the end of Two Towers during the finale of the Battle of Helm's Deep, or the March of the Ents, or the Charge of the Rohirrim. It creates these stirring emotional moments when you're watching it, and that, as well as all the conclusions, makes it hard not to feel the power of this film and to feel emotionally invested within it. And it's incredible, and I think the film is a testament to the strength of its writing, both Tolkien's writing as well as the adaptation. The adaptation as well also uses the visual medium fantastically. Two scenes that spring to mind: there's a 90-second sequence of the signal beacons being lit, panning across the earth, panning across Middle Earth from Gondor to Rohan to a rousing score, which is phenomenal. Or the shot of Denethor taking Faramir to the funeral mausoleum and saying there is no hope in men, and then the camera pans up to the white tree of Gondor, and we see one flower, suggesting that no, the king is returning. And then later on, during Aragorn's coronation, we see that tree in full bloom, due to the return of the king. Yeah, it's absolutely incredible visual storytelling that's done very, very well. Yeah, there's a lot in this film, but I think the film did prove that there was a market for adult fantasy done well. I don't think we'd see things like, the novel of Lord of the Rings inspired so much of adult fantasy, and it's very clear that the film of Lord of the Rings also did the same thing for cinema. I mean, it came out around the same time as the Harry Potter films, but the Harry Potter films were children's stories. They are the family children's stories. Lord of the Rings was, it's a family film in some respects, but it's also an adult fantasy story. And then you see how that has influenced things such as Game of Thrones, for example. Game of Thrones started in 2011. It went into pre-production a few years before that. So within 2003 to 2011, so within those 7 years, and probably about 5 years after the release of Return of the King, you started getting the pre-production for something like Game of Thrones, because while the books for Game of Thrones were already successful, the idea of an adult fantasy market existing and wanting to see something like this was an idea that a lot of film companies might not have been necessarily willing to bank on. And yeah, you wouldn't have had, while there are a lot of things that were probably rushed into production or adapted badly off the back of the Lord of the Rings. For example, what was done to the Aragon novels, which I know have a huge fan base, or the television adaptations of Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series, which were apparently atrocious. I do think we wouldn't necessarily have the adaptations of something like Game of Thrones or Wheel of Time without Lord of the Rings. And that's just part of the legacy and impact. I mean, the films, Lord of the Rings, eventually led to the production of the Hobbit trilogy. The Hobbit trilogy was much more divisive than Lord of the Rings. I'm not going to delve too much into it. If you want to learn more about the Hobbit trilogy and what really went on with it and some of the negatives, Lindsay Ellis on YouTube has done a fantastic video series about it. Um, but yeah, it had a rushed and a very divisive production. Guillermo del Toro was originally attached. It did 2 years of pre-production, only for only to be let go by the studio, supposedly amicably, but then everything suddenly rushed into pre-production for Peter Jackson's version. Warner Brothers was involved as the studio at that point, not New Line, so there was a lot of studio interference on their part. The Hobbit films also had a much more mixed reception upon release, and diminishing box office returns as a result. Very, very divisive among audiences and critics. There was a lot of changes as well in the New Zealand filming landscape. There was a lot of calls for equity off the back of the Lord of the Rings, attempting for New Zealand groups to get similar treatment to British and American film unions, and how it led to an industrial action around the time that The Hobbit was filming, which actually ended up being unsuccessful and led to New Zealand's Hobbit Law, which made workers independent contractors, and benefited Warner Brothers with tax subsidies, while the workers actually earned less, which led to sort of a stifling of a lot of creatives in New Zealand, while foreign productions could go there and save money. So, for example, Avatar was filmed in New Zealand. The Avatar sequels have been filmed in New Zealand. There's also been some unfortunate news of sleaze and scandal of the sort of type you see in a lot of production houses at Weta, which I read about in research for this, which was unfortunate reading. Weta Digital apparently had huge drives of porn, and a lot of women were treated inappropriately or propositioned and all sorts of other things like that. And stuff like that is heartbreaking to read after I've praised their work on this film, because I do think the film is not just Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings or New Line's Lord of the Rings. It is, so many people behind the scenes put their heart and soul into this, and it shows. And to then read that some of those people may be responsible for, mistreatment and suffering of others, it's unfortunate. I don't think there's been any prosecutions or anything, or any conclusive reporting. I think everything's still up in the air, but it's not something you want to hear. There's also going to be a Lord of the Rings TV series coming soon from Amazon, potentially following some of the plots of the Silmarillion. Amazon's already paid like $1 billion for 5 seasons. Only one, I think 2 of which have been filmed already. One of which was filmed in New Zealand. The rest moved to Scotland and the UK. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I want to see it. I think after what happened with the Hobbit films, trying to turn what was a light-hearted children's story into a Lord of the Rings prequel, I'm dubious, but at the same time, the Silmarillion has a very different tone to the Hobbit, one that more closely matches the Lord of the Rings. So if anything is going to fit as a Lord of the Rings prequel series, it should be the Silmarillion. So we'll see. Until then, we can only look to the future, as the popular phrase in Lord of the Rings itself says, the road goes ever on and on. Thank you once again, my friends, for joining me on today's episode. I hope people have found this informative and entertaining. Personally, I was fascinated watching these documentaries on the Lord of the Rings DVDs for the first time. Anyone who may have already seen them probably didn't enjoy this episode as much, but for me, it was absolutely fascinating to get that behind the scenes look at the filmmaking. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, I do think, is a masterpiece of cinema. I'd put it as one of my favourite film experiences. I think you have to qualify it as a single film rather than three. It was always designed as the one film, and I think it is one film rather than a trilogy. So yeah, that's my view on Lord of the Rings, the film, the novel, and everything in between. That concludes my episodes for the year. I'm going to take a small break over Christmas, and then I'm going to release some new episodes next year. This podcast is going to be still being released in podcast format wherever you may be listening to it now, but I'm also going to make it available on YouTube, which should lead to a wider audience as well, so I'm going to need some time to do that. I am hoping to return in the new year. My first episode within the new year will be talking about the MCU again. Always a popular topic, I've noticed, among my audience. We're specifically going to be talking about Spider-Man No Way Home and possibly Hawkeye. There are some rumours of things that may be in the works that we may be expecting to see, which will... if these rumours turn out to be true, that's going to dictate the focus of the episode. If not, then I'm going to be discussing all things Spider. So Sony's previous Spider-Man attempts, where perhaps they went wrong, what they did well, as well as both the three Marvel Spider-Man films, and perhaps even Spider-Verse, now that the sequel for that has a trailer. So either way, it's going to be something Marvel focused, either Spider-Man related or potentially what's upcoming. So if these rumours don't turn out to be true, then we'll get the Spider-Man episode. If the rumours do turn out to be true, we'll get the episode on that first, and then the Spider-Man episode will probably be moved later on. I'm not sure exactly what date we're looking at coming back. I will probably post an update everywhere, so please subscribe to get any notifications of new episodes, and I will give you a season 3 preview probably a week or two before we know when it's releasing. Okay, thank you very much for listening. As always, please use any of the social media links that are going to be upcoming to get in touch with me, to stay in contact, to suggest ideas for new episodes, to join any of the discussions. I'd very much love to hear from any of you that are out there listening. Until next time, take care of yourselves, look after yourselves, get the vaccine if you're able, wear your masks. This new Omicron variant is out there and it's quite scary. But, stay safe, look after yourself, take care of your physical and mental health, for both of them are really important. And have a very good Christmas or other holiday denomination if you are not Christian or atheist. and have a happy new year. Until next year, take care, everyone.
Thank you, my friends, for once again joining me on Garhdo Goes Geek. Your continued support for this podcast means the absolute world to me, and I am grateful for every single one of you who stays and listens to one of my episodes. It means the absolute world. Now, if you would like to engage more with me or the podcast, we have a Discord community, small but growing, and we now have commissions open on Ko-Fi. So if there's a topic you would like to see me cover, you can pay me to cover it. All funds will be used for legal purchase of the relevant items where I do not have them. Have a look on the link tree for more information. Until next time, look after yourselves.